Hello, everybody, and welcome to Limited Level Ups. I'm Alex, and I am not all on my lonesome, thankfully, this week. We've got a guest, a Limited Level Ups podcast regular at this point, Neal Oliver, back at it once again to deliver some great thoughts from his brain into your brain. Neal, how you doing?
Oh, I'm good. Doing real well, Alex. I'm excited to be back. I think, this was actually a while since I was last on, so I don't remember exactly what it was, but I'm excited to be back and talk about some fun discussions around some magic theory and applying it to Bloomborough.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it has been, I'd say, maybe about 6 months since the last time you were on, maybe just shy of that. And if you have not caught a Neil episode before, they're great. They're truly, really nitty gritty level up episodes where usually the way they come about is Neil will message me at some point and be like, hey, I got an idea for a level up. And I'll be like, yeah, like, let's hear it. And he types out some very nice show notes and we put together something together. And of course, that's what we've got today. If you want to give the audience just a little bit of a preview. What's our topic here that you've brought today, Neal?
Yeah, so something I was thinking about actually came from Modern Horizons 3 because in that format, there was actually a lot of open information. And what I mean by open information is things that you can visibly see that your opponent is doing.
Hmm.
Because a lot of the times, like in Magic, we talk about figuring out, like, well, what's your opponent up to and what are they doing? And it gets a little bit obscured because, most of the time, there's hidden cards and you don't know exactly what's in your opponent's hand, and why it gets kind of difficult. But I just was noticing a lot, like in terms of MH3, when you played to the board, there was certain things that would be kind of sitting around, and you'd be like, well, what's going on with my opponent based on what they were doing? And the big thing that made me think about this was when opponents played their fetch lands, right? Because in that format, it's like if your opponent had all the colors in play and then they cycled one, well, it kind of tells you like, well, they didn't need more lands for that. Or maybe if they didn't have a colorless land in play and they cycled their fetch land, you'd be like, okay, well, maybe there's no colorless cards they're trying to dig to because they might have needed that colorless source. And
Hmm.
that's just like scratching the surface. But that kind of got the wheels turning and it's like, well, actually, that kind of applies to any format. And so this idea of like open information and based on what your opponent's actions are, it kind of tells you a lot of stuff about what they're thinking about. And of course, Magic is a game of logic and deduction. So you start doing those little logic puzzles where it's like, Sally can't stand next to Ron, and Ron is 2 feet taller than his brother, so you have to figure out like who his, grand uncle was, and really, so that's kind of what it ends up becoming sometimes.
In Bloomborough, it's the Wolverine, the bunny, and the mouse gets into the boat, and you need to have the boat go over, but you can't have the Wolverine with the mouse, and you can't.
Yep.
Yeah. So this is gonna be I mentioned this last week on the gameplay level up Bloomborough episode, but kind of an extension, honestly, of that episode where I was talking a bit more in broad terms about how to play certain archetypes, how to optimize the way you want to sequence your cards, the little tips and tricks for cards. But this level up is like more specific, but also more broad in the sense that we're getting to the next level of okay, well, once you kind of have a good sense of how to play these decks and how to best use these cards, using that information that you gain in game, like Neil was talking about, but then can be applied to any format, and that's what's so great about these kind of level up episodes. Really, yes, we're going to be talking about Bloomborough. We're going to be talking, maybe have a Modern Horizon 3 reference here and there, but this is stuff that you can apply to every single format, and that's the whole purpose of this podcast. Basically, is to give you some broad, applicable knowledge. And as always, just quickly before we jump in, gonna shout out the Patreon, patreon.com/limited level up. So you can go there if you like what we're doing here, you feel like you learned something, and you want to support the show. It really does help keep the show running and all my content. If you like any of my content, that's the best place you can go to go support it. There's also a bunch of rewards over there for all the reward tiers. Go check them out. Lots of good stuff. That's patreon.com/limited level ups. And without any further ado, let's just dive in.
2, 1, let's go!
All right, let's jump into things. So we're talking about information. We're talking about deducing information. And the way you've laid it out in our show notes here is you made kind of a distinction between open information and closed information. And what exactly do you mean by that, just to kind of set the stage for the rest of what we're talking about here today?
Yeah, so I alluded to it a little bit just before that like closed information is information that your opponent may have that you don't have and that you have that your opponent doesn't have.
Hmm.
And so things like cards in hand or There was a lot of closed information initially in Murders at Karlov Manor because you had the face down creatures. Half of the detective work in that format was figuring out how do I narrow the closed information to get as close to open information as possible, because open information is face up information that all players are privy to. So it's things on the board, things that you can see, and it's like basically what's the game state of the game. And so what lands are available to your opponent is the open information, and then the closed information is what you're trying to deduce. So based on what lands are in play and based on kind of the way that the game is going, what do I think my opponent has in their hand? So the open information directly ties to the closed information, but as a game progresses, you get more and more open information, which then kind of helps you do that detective work to figure out more and more about the closed information. And really, that's what you're doing in basically every game of limited. But to distill it down to that is trying to, like, okay, every single piece of the puzzle, what is it telling me about sort of the flow of the game? And that's what makes like games different, because in a lot of fast-paced games you don't have that much open information to figure out what your opponent's closed information is, because if an opponent curves out 1, 2, 3, 4 with all their creatures and they're using all their mana every single turn, you don't gain that much information about what your opponent is doing because they haven't really had the opportunity to do anything than other than just curve out on you.
Hmm.
And so that's what sometimes makes games really tricky, where you're like, okay, I have no idea if my opponent has a combat trick because all they've done every single turn is play a creature and attack me. And especially if you didn't have like a chance to block in a way where your opponent could use a combat trick, you really haven't gained that much about their closed information. Whereas some games, your opponent might not do anything with the open information of like, or like you won't do anything with the open information of, okay, my opponent is just playing a bunch of swamps every single turn. And I played a small creature, and they didn't kill it. And then I played another small creature, and they didn't kill it. And they're just playing, land after land and not doing anything. Well, the open information they have is, I, all I see is that they have a bunch of swamps. The closed information would be maybe they're missing a color of mana, and maybe if they have a removal spell, they're waiting for me to play like my 6 drop because maybe they can handle my 2 and 3 mana cards once they finally get their second color of mana. But that, again, there's a lot of inference. So what I wanted to do with this discussion is talk more like specific cards, because certain types of cards give you more open information, which can help inform the closed information more.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think the first one that you listed here is a really good one, and one that we've seen in a lot of formats. See is a little bit less play in this one than some other ones, but Hidden Grotto, the Surveil land, it's definitely one that when you're surveilling, you know what you're looking for. Generally, you kind of say, okay, well, sometimes you just play your Surveil land and you're not looking for anything in particular. But when you see the thing, you're like, okay, I kind of know if I want to keep that or not based on what I have in hand, based on what the game state is, based on what I might need. And of course, the opponent's doing the exact same thing too. And so when your opponent plays a Hidden Grotto, you should be paying attention to them. By the way, that's one thing too. I think people, don't want to overgeneralize here, but I think a lot of Magic players don't pay as much attention to their opponent's game actions as they should. So if you're somebody who's just like, yeah, I tend to like space out on the opponent's turn or really focus on my own stuff, then this episode is really going to get you into the swing of those things. But like when your opponent plays a Hidden Grotto, what are all those the things that you might be considering based on what they choose to keep? Well, I guess you don't know what they choose to keep, but when you see them put a card in the graveyard, that gives you a lot of information. So yeah, I just like to hear you talk out some of that kind of stuff.
Yeah, so if your opponent puts a card in the graveyard, the easiest deduction is then they don't want whatever that type of thing is, right?
Yep.
So the simplest version of this is it's turn 10 and they put a land in the graveyard. Okay, they don't want to draw any more lands, right?
Yeah, they
We've
don't
all
have.
been there. That makes a lot of sense. It's
Yep.
almost like drawing a card at that point. But also, if you work your way backwards, like let's say it's like turn 1 and they play a grotto and they put a 2 drop in the graveyard. Well, that really tells me one of two things. It either tells me their hand is just chock full of 2 drops and they're looking for something like more specific, like maybe they're looking for a removal spell, or maybe they're looking for like something higher up the curve. Because if you already have 2 or 3 2 drops in hand, you don't really want to draw the third or fourth one.
Hmm.
Um, or it's telling me they're really looking for a land, right? Because if you normally you would want a 2 drop on turn 2. So if you play a turn 1 grotto and you've been a 2 drop and you wanted that normally, it means they kept like maybe they're on the draw and I don't know, they kept a sketchy hand and they're looking for like maybe their third land and they just played on turn 1. It's possible. Um, and so you kind of want to like think like, well, based on their action, what is it going on? But it kind of goes further than that because you also get open information about their action even if they leave the card on top. Because
Hmm.
if we think about if your opponent plays a turn 1 or maybe a turn 2 Shimmering Grotto, what are they generally going to be looking for early in the game? Usually it's going to be a land because if the inverse is true, where like we talked about turn 10, you play it and you're going to bend the land every single time, you kind of want to wait for that scenario where you know the specific thing you're looking for. And so the longer you can kind of hold on to that hidden grotto, the more specific information you're going to have when you play it. And so if you have a land heavy hand, you don't usually want to play it as long as you have other plays. You know, if you already have a 3 and a 4 drop, if you can wait until turn 4 to play it and look for like, you know, that 5 drop that you're really looking for, it can be super useful. Especially if you don't know that you already have your 5th land versus the 5 drop you're looking for. Again, are you looking for a land or not? So the longer you
Yeah.
hold the card, the more likely it is that you don't need lands. So the sooner you play the card, the more likely you probably are looking for lands. And then just to make it simpler, right? If your opponent gets rid of something specific, well, that kind of tells you they're not looking for it. So it would be really weird if on turn 2 or 3 your opponent played Hidden Grotto and like they have access to black mana and they put a saber in the graveyard.
Right.
Kind of a weird play because you're like, well, normally that card's pretty good in the opening phases of the game. So you think they probably would want access to it, if not now, to maybe double spell on turn 4 or 5. Probably tells me they either have another copy or they have just a lot of ways to, you know, gum up the ground and things like that.
Yeah,
Uh,
or there was a situation I ran into the other day that just kind of I remembered when you just said that where I was playing a not a typical matchup in this format, but blue black control versus blue black control. Opponent saw that I didn't play anything on turn 1, didn't play anything on turn 2. I also didn't play anything on turn 3. I just had a lot of instants, and they surveilled a saver into the graveyard on the third or second turn or something. And I think that was a heads up play from them because they just said, okay, if we're just going to sit around and not do anything. I don't really want this cheap removal spell. And they might not even had another cheap removal spell in hand. I actually don't think they did. But they smartly were like, this matchup is not about cheap removal spells. So to put that in the grave. So that just, told me the opponent was really thinking, using their head there.
yep, that's a great example.
Sorry, I didn't mean to derail you. Go
No,
ahead.
that was pretty much
Yeah.
it on Hidden
Yeah.
Grotto. I mean,
Okay. Okay.
but I think the takeaway from this is that Hidden Grotto, it's funny because of the name. It's like the least hidden of these grottos. You get to see literally what your opponent is doing with the card. But we've seen a lot of the Shimmering Grottos in the past where it's like a scry version.
Uh-huh.
And so I talked about how like you have a ton of open information based on what your opponent is doing with the Hidden Grotto. And you might think, okay, well, when my opponent has Shimmering Grotto, like I don't see what they're doing. So I don't really have that much open information. And it's true that you have less, but their open action that they take with the scry tells you a lot about where it is in terms of the game. So the timing of the actions that take place in a game have drastically different consequences. Where again, Shimmering Grotto, they scry top on turn 2. Well, it's probably going to be a 3 drop they're looking for or a land. And pretty soon you're going to see, did they miss a land drop or did they really need that 3 drop or what was it? Versus the late game. If they bottom, yeah, probably they put a 1 or 2 drop on the bottom or a land. So I mean, it's still open information there of their action, but it kind of tells you about the close information.
Yeah, and I think one thing that is a little bit tricky is, and then what? Right? And then you're like, okay, well, I've got this information. What do I do with it? Obviously, it's going to be a it depends answer, unfortunately, like most magic things are. But the way I kind of process things like that is it's almost like you just write it down on the clip note or on the write down your clipboard or write down your sticky note like this is a new piece of information I have. Oh, they didn't deem that a combat trick would be good in this situation for whatever reason. They didn't deem that a 2 drop would be good here. And it might not be immediately apparent. Like you could infer things from that and extrapolate, certainly. But I don't think you need to. I don't think you need to immediately expand on that. You can just say, they don't want a combat trick here. So something happens later down the line, you're playing the next few turns out, you just have that piece of information. And it might not be apparent right away why it's relevant to you, but then in a few turns, you still have that piece of information. They didn't want a combat trick. And it might mean, they don't think it's going to be good in the matchup. It might mean they already have multiple tricks. It might mean they don't have creatures and they're looking for creatures, looking for lands. You're not sure just yet. But keep that little piece of information in the back of your head, and something might click where you go, "Oh, that information is actually relevant for me in this spot right here."
Yeah, that's a good one. Not forgetting about it down the line. And then also it kind of tells about your opponent's intent too. I had this fancy play like week 1 of the format that I thought was pretty interesting, where I had the Dark Star Augur, which is the Dark Confidant rare, and a Fountain Port Bell. And I was like, oh, this is a kind of neat play that I get to do. So I played the Fountain Port Bell, and then with the search for the land trigger on the stack, I cracked it to draw a card and then put a land on top. So I would hit it off the Augur next turn and not lose life.
Mhm.
Um, but from my opponent's perspective, I was at like 10 life or something. And I mean, that kind of makes sense that I want to put a land on top, but it also is telling the information that I am valuing my life total much more than getting whatever extra card that would be, right?
Right. Yep.
Um, my hand was already pretty stacked. So in a different game, I might just be like, I'm at 20. I definitely don't want to draw a land, even though it's going to cost me life on the next turn. So I wouldn't make that play, right?
Yep.
And so it kind of might put them in the driver's seat anyways, which they kind of want to be doing when someone has a Dark Confidant play. They might just be trying to deal me as much damage as possible, because I'm basically telling them, like, I really don't want to take damage from this, even though it's giving me card advantage. And especially because I had the 8-drop
Oh, the
thing that gets
swarm.
less. Yeah, yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was living life on the edge that day, but
Yeah, no, totally. And just as far as, just tangentially related, one thing, a situation where this is all the stuff we're talking about is kind of relevant is there's spots where your opponent has missed a land drop for multiple turns. And I'm not talking about the early turns. I'm talking about, it's turn 4 and they play their 4th land and they don't play another land for the next 3 turns. Well, you know that they've got action in hand, right? And especially, they might pass the turn with mana up. And when you're always trying to deduce, okay, could they have an instant here, or removal spell, blow up my polywall up or my combat trick or my double block? It's so much more likely if they do have just 4 lands in play and haven't played a land for the past little while that they have some action in hand. And so just like your range of what to expect really changes either in that situation you said with the Dark Star Augur, where you're just like, okay, like I want the land and I just don't want to take some damage here. But also considering how much mana your opponent has available, have they missed those land drops? That's all part of determining how likely or not likely they are to have action in hand, to have removal spells, combat tricks, ways to interact when you go for a risky play. So it's all just trying to take all that information in and use it in whatever way you deem relevant as the game goes on.
yeah, and that's the tricky part too, right? Because if you're staring at your opponent, especially if they're playing like a blue black deck, you're like, oh my gosh, they could have
Anything.
10 different things here, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And so that's kind of where it gets scary with the closed information. It can be kind of overwhelming. But that's why I think open information is also kind of useful to kind of, it's not quite training wheels, but it's the idea of seeing, okay, this is what my opponent has available to them. Are they taking actions based on that open information? So one of my favorite examples of this in this format, in general, is food tokens, right?
Yep.
Because with food, um, when my opponent has 2 available mana at the end, I'm passing back to them, and they don't crack their food, it's like, well, okay, that's open information for me. It's like, generally, if I could just spend some mana to get some life, that sounds kind of nice, but tells me that they're valuing that food much more for the forage than the life. And it also kind of tells me that in a pinch, they're thinking they're going to have 2 mana open down the line. So sometimes it might say that they have more lands in hand, because that can sometimes be hard to figure out. Like if they've just been playing a land every single turn and then it's turn 4 and they just have 2 mana up that they're going to burn for whatever reason, like maybe they put a 2-drop and didn't do anything else. If you're in that situation and you have no lands in hand, right? Most of the time you're just going to crack the food, because you're like, I'm not going to have another chance for this. I'm going to spend my mana for the next 5 turns in the game. I'm going to spend 4 mana every single turn. I don't care that I'm at 20 life. I'm going to get my 3 life right now.
Yep.
If you're in the situation where you've got 2 to 3 more lands in hand, you've got a few more spells, but not that much, you don't really know how you want to use your food, especially if you have forage in your deck. And so you're like, okay, I'm just going to wait. So when your opponent doesn't use that mana, it also tells you quite a bit about what's going on. Even if they play their next land, maybe that tells you, like when my opponent would not spend that 2 mana and then they draw. If they play the land, it either tells me that, hey, maybe they just drew that fifth land, or yeah, they really just want to forage with this.
Yep. Yeah, that's a fantastic example. And one thing that might be going through people's head here, when you're trying to deduct information from things your opponents are doing is sometimes your opponent can make a wrong choice, a wrong assumption, so that when you're thinking, all right, what did they do, and what should I do because of that? There is a chance that what they thought was right to do and what you think, okay, well, based on that action, if they think that's right to do, then I should do this, could actually be just the wrong thing to do. Like they are not acting in a way that you would have acted. But it's really important. Something you've noted here is I think it's always good to assume that the opponent is playing well, operating like you say here within their best interests, because I think you make more mistakes if you just assume that all your opponents are not making good plays. You're going to sometimes stumble because there will be an opponent who makes a play that doesn't make logical sense, and you're trying to infer, well, what could that possibly mean? But most of the time, people are operating with some sort of logic. So just something that might be going through your head.
Yeah, and sometimes you'll realize that a few turns down the line.
Yeah.
I like how you said, okay, well, my opponent made a play where I kind of think they have that combat trick, so I'm going to play like they have it, and you give them like 3 chances in a row to use their
Hmm.
combat trick in a good spot, and they don't use it. You might just go, oh, I was wrong, but like,
Yeah.
it's okay. You get more information later on, but that's much better to do than you just run headfirst into it in 3 turns, and you're like, oh yeah, I did kind of think maybe they had that, and now you're way behind in the game because of it.
Exactly. And one thing also is this: you do catch your opponent making a play that doesn't quite make logical sense. That's then plausible deniability for future turns. It's like, well, if they didn't make a play that made sense there, maybe I shouldn't put as much stock into the play they're making here. That doesn't make sense to me. Obviously, it's on sliding scales. You're not just like, oh, the opponent made a play that didn't make sense. Like they're dumb and their plays don't make any sense. No, 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 no. But it's just adjusting slightly. So like when you have a future situation in that same game, don't always rack your brain going like, what could it be? It might not actually be anything that makes sense.
Yeah, and this is totally off topic of what we're going to talk about today, and probably be a future episode. But when you talk about like that, kind of starts to enter the realm of like the type of player that your opponent is.
Hmm.
Sometimes you get in those situations where you have like a semi bluff situation where like you attack, and you have a combat trick, but you'd really rather not use it. But it also kind of doesn't make sense for your opponent to block because it's going to put them way behind, and you're still going to get to use your mana in other ways. But your opponent might block with like a really good creature to your not so great creature, right? So you're like, okay, I'll use my whole turn to, you know, get rid of your creature when I had a removal spell for it anyway, something like that.
Yeah.
But that's useful information too, because in the future, if you know your opponent always is going to block, you could use that too to your advantage, and vice versa. Like if your
Yeah.
opponent never blocks, that's also pretty good to know too. Totally off topic.
No, no, it's a really good point, and I think it's something that comes up in a lot of games. I just I'll continue the off topic train here quickly, but I had a game the other day where the opponent had a really sick looking red white deck, and they went like Heartfire Hero. I think it's called the one drop in red that gets counters on it when you target it. Into Manifold Mouse, the rare thing that makes your mouse double striking or trample, into some other good 3 drop. And just like I might have been even Mabel. I think it was actually Mabel. It was just like
Yes.
fantastic start. And I was like, I kind of threw up my hands. I was like, I'm just dead here. And it actually turned out that I wasn't just dead. And the opponent, I think, was playing a little bit scared. I was playing a green white deck where I was going a little bit wide. They stopped attacking me around turn 5. I was a low life total. And there was definitely a few spots where I was like, if they just kept attacking me, I would be forced to make some really bad blocks here. And maybe they didn't kill me, but they would have put me in a really tough spot. And I think they were overly worried about me attacking them back, basically, because I would have had to block. I couldn't actually attack them back for lethal. And I used that information on a later turn. Maybe like it was like 10 turns down the line. This game went on quite long. And I kind of thought, okay, they're the type of player to play a little bit scared here. So I can take a little bit of a risk. I can't remember the exact play, but there was a line I was like, if they were going to attack me every single turn, or really be looking for all their little spots where they could push damage, I don't think I would make this play. But because I know they're playing a little bit scared, I think it had something to do with leaving up mana on my opponent's turn. I think I can get away with this, and it ended up working out. So it's those kind of things where you can apply that player information, what the kind of player your opponent might be, into the game and actually make some sort of tangible advantage from it.
Yeah, and sometimes the tangible advantage of that too is like maybe you're not playing a rabbit response right in your deck, but you're
Hmm.
going pretty wide, and in that situation, your opponent's a little bit scared of it. And so let's say like you realize that you get into a position where like you really don't have that great of attacks, but if you realize like all your small creatures will get through and your opponent sets up trades based on the
Hmm.
fact that when you attack all, they're kind of like thinking like what's the worst possible thing for me? Well, if my opponent is representing a rabbit response, so they might line up blocks in a way where normally they could just eat some of your smaller things, but they actually want to trade even because they're worried about the +2/+1. So you can kind of do things like that too.
Yeah, you play with your opponent's expectations a little bit, and if you're in that situation, go for the quick attack, draw your card, go for the attack. If you think that's the thing you're supposed to do, don't wait too long because the quick attack is usually the little indicator that's like, oh, they did draw something that makes this attack good.
Now that we're totally off topic, let's
Yeah,
try to
sorry,
bring
it's
us
like a
back a
little
little bit
aside.
because what essentially we just did was we're building the narrative, right?
Right.
We talked about okay, well, if we have this open information, and then we start to see what our opponents are doing, and then we're kind of understanding their play style or closed information, then we can make some actionable plays based on that. And that's kind of the point of the episode. But if we go all the way back to the open information, we just only talked about the hidden grotto. But I think all, and we talked a little bit about food tokens.
Hmm.
But the interesting thing about those cards is like they have an immediate impact and it kind of stops happening. So, one thing that you really want to pay attention to when it's available, that information is kind of onboard activated abilities. Um, because every time your opponent has the option to do something and then they either do or don't, it actually tells you quite a bit about like what it is they're trying to set up for.
Hmm.
It could be something like a planeswalker where you think they're going to use it one way and they do something else, and it's like, oh, they're trying to build to an ultimate. I thought they were just going to use it as some removal. Okay, they're trying to quickly end the game with this. But I think the pinnacle of this example that kind of came to mind for me is the Bumbleflower share pot,
Yep.
because it kind of just sits in play and it requires you to use 5 mana, right? So it basically is like you can use your turn in most cases to blow something up. And you were talking about the example earlier where your opponent just like 4 or 5 mana and they're just passing turn after turn, but they have all these cards in hand. And they have missed some land drops. Well, in that circumstance, it kind of tells you like, yeah, your opponent probably has some instants. But let's say they have exactly 5 mana in play and they got the Bumbleflower share pot sitting there, and you've got like a semi decent target and they choose not to use it. That should be alarm bells, right? Because the
Yeah.
open information is like, I've got a removal spell I'm ready to use. I can
Yep.
only use it on my turn. Go ahead. And you're like, okay,
Hmm.
something's up, right? Clearly they think they're gonna do something more effective than using the Bumbleflower share pot. Um, and sometimes it might be as simple as like you got a couple tutus and they're like, actually, I don't have anything else going on, but I'm not going to blow up your tutu with this because I think it's going to be more valuable information. But sometimes it's like, yeah, you've got, a 2-1 in play and a 4-4, and they don't blow up your 4-4. And they pass the turn to you, and you're like, well, that's really weird, but whatever, attack.
Yeah.
And then they play downwind ambusher, right? Kill your
Yep.
1-1, trade with your 4-4. And you're like, oh,
Blech. Gross.
you know, that's a very good exchange for them. And maybe you could have seen that coming because generally, your opponent probably would use the share pot on it. If you go a step further, what if you had a 10-4 in play, right? And they don't kill it, Um, so the more extreme the scenario, the more it tells you about it. And the thing about sorcery speed actions that you can see is that you're literally seeing like the choices that your opponents are making or not making, and it tells you something about maybe how you should respond. When we
Yeah.
talked about the food and cracking it during the instep, it kind of tells you a little bit something, but it kind of tells you about like what your opponent's maybe overall plan is or something a little bit about their hand. It's not as impactful because they get to immediately have that option again, right? If I pass to my opponent and they choose not to use their mana on something available at instant speed, they're immediately going to untap and they could just do that again immediately. So the
Mm-hmm.
window of use on something on the board that can be activated at instant speed is so much different than something sorcery speed, because the turn cycle is huge in a game of Magic, right? Like most games are only like 8 turns or whatever it is. So every single time that you pass with that much mana, it's essentially a huge cost. And so that's why I really like looking at that card and thinking like, okay, why didn't my opponent use that? You know.
Yeah, whenever there's something like the share pot, or maybe my opponent has a revealed card in hand somehow, they found it off of an instant or sorcerer off their Thundertrap trainer, or something that makes them reveal the card, so I know that the card's in their hand. Anything that's face up, basically. And they pass the turn, and I go, so they have something that the thing I always say, they have something that's better than this. They have a play that's better than this. And again, when you're going to application, it doesn't necessarily have to be exactly pinpointing it, but you're thinking, okay, well, I know it's probably going to be like whatever, just vindicating my permanent was not the play they wanted to make. So I probably shouldn't go for a risky play, a combat trick. They clearly have something better than that. Anytime, I think it's a good thing to think about anytime the opponent has any of that open revealed information.
Also, like any time we're just saying it's like time limited, right? When we thought about the share pod, is like it's kind of like a turn cycle, it's sorcery speed. But then another one, like we talked about back in MH3, it'd be kind of interesting, like if your opponent chose not to use their essence reliquary, because
Hmm.
you can use it anytime on your turn, that card that bounces something. But sometimes when I had that card, it's like I don't really want to use this. And what that usually meant was I really want to just keep whatever that trinket value thing is in play because I'm going to do something with my mana for the next 2 turns. So, like,
Right.
yeah, I could bounce my conduit goblin, which could give me some more energy, but I don't want to do that because I know I'm going to be tapping out and casting 4 and 5 drops for the next 2 turns. I'd rather just let my 2/2 sit in play so it can attack.
Well,
Um,
hey, in Bloomberg, we even have an example too. The Sticky Tongue Sentinel, right? Sometimes your opponent doesn't pick up a good, like a Baker's Bane duel, for example. It's
mhm.
like, okay, they don't want additional food. They have other stuff to do with their mana.
Another one that I really like that you brought up, I think a few episodes ago, was with the corpseberry cultivators, and
Yeah.
I was loving that card from the start, and I was so glad when you said it can kind of be your plan, right?
Yeah.
Because I was noticing when I had a deck with like anywhere from like 2 to 4 of them, sometimes I would draw two, and it's like when you play the first one, well, if I just wait a turn, I kind of get double the counters for my forage value. So when your opponent like has 6 cards in their graveyard and they have a cultivator and they don't use it, you're like, wow, like they really have a lot of other forage, or maybe they have another cultivator. Like you can quickly kind of see something about what their plan is, because why wouldn't they just do that?
Right, exactly. Yeah, that's another good example. And here's a just I kind of jotted down a few other things from Bloomborough that you can really use to deduce some information, some open information. One is a pretty obvious one: just when the opponent has the mana to offspring an offspring creature, but they don't do it. I had a situation. I was looking at a game log earlier from somebody I was having a coaching session with, and it was for turn four. They had the lizard, common lizard offspring 2/1 that when it dies, you deal 1 damage to the opponent. And they just paid it for 2 mana when they had 4 lands in play. And the active player, the person's game log we were going over, they went for an attack that they plan to use a combat trick during. And I was like, I think that's a really, really, really bad idea. You don't want to attack your 2/2 into their 3/3. They go for the block, you go for the trick, because clearly that 2 mana means something. And it turned out not to be too bad because it was just a counter spell and the creatures just traded. It was actually a 3/1 into a 3/3. But that's the kind of thing where it's like, all right, you gotta really watch that. And that's, I think, one of the more obvious times. But some of the other things that can really give you some information, one that's come up a lot for me recently, is the opponent playing a creature pre-combat to give their Polywallop a discount, to give their Scales of Shale a discount, make their Sonar Strike gain life. Like, those are really big things. Like, they didn't have a bat in play before. They played their bat pre-combat. And most good players play their creatures post-combat, right? So that should already tip you off to something. Scales of Shale is a big one. They play a lizard pre-combat. Doesn't even need to have no other lizards to play. Just one more lizard means the Scales is cheaper. Not leveling up a class card on their turn. That means, again, it's this thing where it's like, okay, they clearly have something better to do than level up their class. Another one that's kind of interesting is playing a card post-combat that has in-combat relevance. So, for example, the red-black lizard mentor, the uncommon that when you deal damage to them, you flip the top two cards of your library. You can play one of them on your main phase two. Well, that has to be on the battlefield on main phase one for it to actually trigger. So if your opponent does play that main phase two, it means they had some combat relevant card that they needed to hold up, and then they were like, all right, they didn't block. I'm then gonna just deploy this mentor, not get the trigger. But I preferred to have the option to use this Scales of Shale or Savor in combat or whatever it was. And then one that I see not exclusive to this format, but Carrot Cake is a good example of when this might happen. Whenever you have something that scries, or you look at the top card of your library, if you're trying to deduce if your opponent has drawn something relevant for a turn, one of the tip ops that they haven't against some players is they'll crack their carrot cake main phase because they've drawn 5 lands in a row and they're like, I just gotta, I gotta find out right now if there's a land on top. It's that frustration of being like, I can't believe I drew another land. And that is in a lot of games actually tipped me off to making a play I wouldn't have otherwise, because even if the opponent, you can tell they're flooding a little bit. They've drawn 3 lands in a row. They haven't really done anything. You're beating them down. They're not making any blocks because they can't make any blocks really. But every turn they could draw that pump spell or that removal spell or something that changes combat. And if they do make a play like that, that frustration, like just gotta see if I had that land on top. Some play that makes me think they just drew another land. I'll go, oh, okay, nothing's changed, and I actually can use this combat trick on an unblocked creature for lethal, where I would have been more conservative if they hadn't played exactly that way.
Yeah, and I mean, I think Carrot Cake is also a cool one. You get a lot of open information too, based again on that scry.
Mm-hmm.
One thing that can be kind of cool with Carrot Cake is like, let's say you have like a 3-2, and your opponent, only has it's turn 4 and they play the Carrot Cake and they scry top. Well, in that case, the open information is they have a good card on top, and they've got a 1-1. And normally, I'm not a big fan of like attacking a 3-2 into my opponent's 2-1-1s. Like,
Mm-hmm.
generally not a great exchange.
Yep.
But the open information is telling me my opponent already has a good card on top. So in that spot, I'm much more incentivized to attack with my 3-2 because it forces them to use the Carrot Cake now and kind of remove the opportunity for the value of the scry in the future.
Yeah.
So if you can kind of find those timing windows based on the open information, it can also be really, really good. And it can kind of also help you level up in terms of the implied closed information in the future. There was one time where my opponent was attacking, they were playing lizards and they had just enough mana where they could cast Scale of Shale on their creature. And I don't remember the exact specific scenario, but for some reason, I could decide to either block and then cast Dire Downdraft if they had the Scales of Shale to kind of nullify trade, basically semi 2-for-1 them. But then I'd still let the other creatures through.
Mm-hmm.
But I also realized I actually have a really unique situation here where they have just enough mana for the Scales of Shale. So if I actually cast it before blockers, it puts them in a bind of they have to act first, where they could use it now. Or if they don't, then I get to block very profitably because they no longer have the mana
Yeah.
to cast it. So it was kind of like a really weird scenario. And I kind of had decided in the scenario, okay, it's actually better for me to use it, pre-blocks, force them to use it. And I still could get some good blocks in, and they still got a little bit of value off the lifelink. But I thought that ended up being better than the default play of just let them cast it and do that. Obviously, what the specific play would be correct is in different scenarios. But if you start to kind of look at that, like, okay, it doesn't really make sense why my opponent's attacking this way unless they have this exact card, you can make informed plays too off of that. So the open information in that case is I'm attacking you with a bunch of creatures that don't do well in this combat, which pretty quickly leads to the closed information of I've got a pretty specific plan in mind, and you can use that to your advantage.
Yeah, no, that's a great example. All right, yeah, sweet. This was very, I think, succinct in a lot of ways, because it's a topic that, one, I think a lot of people just might not be thinking about. Two, you could be the kind of person where you're thinking about things but not exactly sure what places to look for this kind of information. Or three, you should be looking for it, and you kind of know where to look for it, but then not exactly sure what to do with it. And of course, If you are at that stage, like we said, it's a little bit tricky because it's game in, game out. Going to change. Different situations are going to have you act a little bit differently. But I really think that for me, the big takeaway from this would be just start. I say this in the end of a lot of episodes, a little bit level up episodes, because it's good broad advice. I think is that if you're not quite on this level of all the stuff we're talking about just today, or you'd like to get a little bit better at it, it seems daunting. It seems like a lot. Just start thinking about it. Just start doing it a little more in game. I'm sure just even listening to us talk about this, making you more aware of these things, will make it easier to process. Because when it comes down to it, I think one of the challenges of playing a game of Magic is managing your processing power. Good players, they're better at that because they can kind of backload stuff to the things that just their intuition tells them what to do. But when you're actively thinking about these things, it can be really tough. Training your intuition on these things requires you to actively through the motions and figure out these things. So in your next games, just look for any of these kind of little informational tells, the open information, what you can deduce, and you're not always going to come to the right conclusion. This is the thing that to not get discouraged on. It's not about getting to the right conclusion right away. It's about getting to the point where you can, yeah, even make that decision, right? Even knowing you have that option to make the decision. Before Neal popped on, or before we started recording, Neal was saying one of the biggest things in Magic, and I say this all the time, that is hard as far as leveling up goes, is you don't know what you don't know a lot of the time. And the next level of that is if you don't put into practice things you do kind of know, your brain's not gonna intake it and it's not gonna start using those tools on future games. So yeah, like I said, I think it's something that is a tricky topic, but hopefully this gives you a little more confidence. Neal, anything to close this out? Anything, any buttons, any tips for using all the stuff we talked about today?
Well, I think the main thing is when we're looking at like future sets, right? And we're thinking about open information, it kind of varies set to set, like how much is on board, how much open information is there, how do we think about the cards, how can you quickly adapt to it? Because oftentimes when you're kind of starting at a set, you might be like, I want to know what the combat tricks are, what are the removal spells, maybe what are some general things my opponent could be doing, what are some of the archetypes. But if you look to like specific types of play patterns and mechanics, some are going to be like more on board than others. Like you had mentioned, um, your opponent might make some weird pre-combat plays to open up options, and like if a set has an exalted as a mechanic, right? You always just play that pre-combat, so you get +1/+1. Well,
Hmm.
like the more that kind of thing happens on board, the less they're going to be able to have combat tricks up. And so different types of open information are going to allow for different styles of gameplay. I had mentioned the Murders at Karlov Manor, which that set had a lot of onboard information, but it was actually a lot of hidden information, which I think was frustrating for a lot of people. But training yourself with the open information to kind of figure out the closed information, like based on what my opponent is doing, what could that be? You start to learn like subsets of cards. Like it's not that my opponent could have 20 things or 20 or 50 things. Maybe they can have these 2 to 5 based on what they're doing. And so that's that training you're talking about, right? Where if it seems daunting, if you just start at the baseline, then it gives a foundation to kind of work towards starting to decipher it. I was kind of blown away, years ago. My friend Ben Whites, who now works at R&D, great Magic player. But it was back in an era like he was like always a constructed master, and I was kind of like better at limited. And something he explained to me is like constructed is all about recognizing play patterns, and it's not that it's more or less complicated, but it's about these very specific things that you just start to realize because you play the same matchups over and over again. So if you went into it and you had no idea, it's actually like extremely more complicated than limited. But if you practice the same thing over and over and over again, in a way it becomes much more scripted and easier to recognize what's going on because it's the same type of information. So kind of the closed information almost becomes open information in constructed because your opponent plays a land and you know exactly maybe the 5 cards in their hand from that point, which isn't the case in limited. But he was talking about this one matchup where there was a 4 mana instant draw spell, and there was like a 3 mana counter spell in the format. And what he was trying to do with a proactive deck is he's like, I always want to make sure that I have a play on turn 4, which I thought was like really interesting because
Mm.
he's like, well, if you play something on turn 4, your opponent either has to choose to then counter it or play that draw spell, right? Whereas if you play something on turn 3 and you don't have a turn 4 play, it allows your opponent to counter spell and then play the draw spell.
Yeah.
And so again, it's kind of like these gradations of what you're trying to achieve. But the first step is, what's the open information? Kind of what can I figure out from that? The second step is, okay, there's this open information here, but there's closed information as well. And what can I kind of start to figure out based on the closed information, based on the open information? And you can kind of do that slowly. And then the third step, which I'm always trying to get to because it's really, really hard, is anticipating the state of like closed information and like what are going to be like sort of the ebbs and flows of a meta game, and what
Yeah.
game states kind of look like. And even we've seen it in Bloomborough, right, where it's like early on it's just streamlined squirrels deck, streamlined rabbits deck, streamlined bats deck, or whatever it is, and like really good versions of the deck, and you see exactly what the archetypes do. And it gets a little more muddier and fuddy-duddy as we go along, because it's like,
Mhm.
well, people can't get that stuff anymore. And so now it's like, okay, well, my opponent might be a little bit slower, what can I anticipate? And that's really that level 3 stuff too. So kind of figure out where you're at and start to ask yourself, like, how can I move to that next level? And it's really just being critical and thinking about how games play out all the way from this specific game to like a whole subset of games.
Yeah, and that is, I think you kind of touched on what makes Magic such a great and interesting game. No matter how long you play, there's always another level of thinking. There's always that next level of meta analysis you can be doing, and yeah, it kind of just never stops. But getting to that, that those first few levels, that'll get you a really, really long way. All right, great episode. Thanks so much, Neil, once again for coming on, bringing the idea of this episode this way. I thought it was a great one, especially following up a recent gameplay episode. I'm sure we'll have you on once again, and sometime in the near future. Anything you want to leave the listeners with? Anything you want to plug, or just
Nope, no plugs.
night?
Just
Great.
just happy to be here.
So yeah, no, and we're happy to have you. All right. Well, once again, thank you so much, everybody out there listening. Thank you for watching and listening, and we'll see you next time on the next episode of Limited Level Ups. Bye, everybody.